It's Friday, February 16th. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Stevie Hertz.
And I'm Dan Rabb. The winter flu season continues, but many New Yorkers still aren't vaccinated. Doctors are asking why.
Why don't you want to get the flu shot? I want them to, defend their answer. Why is it that they're not doing it?
Commuters might soon be charged to drive into Manhattan south of 60th Street, but some say cab drivers shouldn't have to pay.
I think it's worth thinking about yellow taxis as being part of the public transportation system.
And the movie Black Panther is heading towards a record-breaking opening weekend. At a Harlem theater last night, moviegoers were stoked.
I just love the diversity, how they kept to the African roots with the all-natural hair and the traditional clothing.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
I'm Jamie Floyd. This is All Things Considered on WNYC. Special Counsel Robert Mueller announced the indictments this afternoon.
The defendants allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States.
Complete coverage on the charges and what happens next coming up. Plus an update on the shooting rampage in Florida and the recent breakdown in the Senate over immigration and what it means for DACA recipients. Just ahead, after news headlines.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Special Counsel Robert Mueller is bringing a federal indictment against a group of Russian operatives for attempting to undermine the U.S.'s political system, which includes attacking the 2016 presidential election. NPR's Tamara Keith reports on the 37-page indictment against 13 Russian nationals and 3 entities for allegedly waging information warfare against the United States of America.
According to the indictment, these Russian efforts began in 2014 and continued past the 2016 election, working to get Donald Trump elected, working against Hillary Clinton, as well as the people Trump was running against in the primary. And the indictment also says, quote, some defendants posing as U.S. persons without revealing their Russian association communicated with unwitting individuals associated with the Trump campaign and other political activists to seek to coordinate political activities.
That's NPR's Tamara Keith. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein sought to clarify 2 important points as he announced the indictment against Russian operatives today.
Now, there is no allegation in this indictment that any American was a knowing participant in this illegal activity. There is no allegation in the indictment that the charged conduct altered the outcome of the 2016 election.
The White House put out a statement in which it reiterated in caps, no collusion. Parents are starting to hold funerals for their children who are among the 17 people killed in Wednesday's shooting massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. One of them is Lori Aladev, who appeared on CNN and had this message for President Trump, whose youngest son is still in school.
President Trump, Barron goes to school. Let's protect Barron. Let's also protect all these other kids here in Parkland, in Florida, in the United States of America, because we earned it, just like how you earned the right to protect Barron.
NPR's Greg Allen reports Florida Senator Bill Nelson says he believes the nation may have reached a turning point in the debate over gun legislation.
Nelson reiterated comments he made earlier this week on the Senate floor, calling for stricter background checks for people buying guns and a ban on weapons like the Sig Sauer used in the Pulse nightclub shootings and the AR-15 used in Parkland. Nelson says he's heard similar calls from many of the students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School.
The kids are just terrific. The fact that they are speaking up as boldly as they are, maybe that's the turning point.
Today, Broward County School Superintendent said the building where the shootings occurred will be closed, and he'll seek funds to build a replacement.
That's NPR's Greg Allen reporting the FBI now concedes it failed to act on a tip it received last month about the suspected gunman being a possible danger. Attorney General Jeff Sessions says he is now ordering an immediate review of the FBI's response. Before the closing bell, the Dow was up 18 points. You're listening to NPR News.
This is
from Columbia Radio News in New York. I'm Augusta Anthony. The NYPD has arrested a former teacher and his twin brother after explosive materials were found at their home in the Bronx. Christian Toro, a 27-year-old high school teacher, is accused of paying his students to take apart fireworks to get gunpowder. Toro resigned after the school received a bomb threat in December last year, and instructions were later found on his laptop detailing how to make explosive devices. Toro and his brother Tyler face a maximum sentence of 10 years. The New Yorker published a salacious article today alleging President Trump had an affair with former Playboy Playmate of the Year Karen McDougal. Beginning in 2006, McDougal claims the affair continued for 9 months during the president's marriage to First Lady Melania Trump. McDougal was paid $150,000 for her story by the National Enquirer during the 2016 election. The Enquirer's publisher, David Pecker, a longtime friend of President Trump, failed to run the story. A group of 11 dreamers and their allies set off from New York City's Battery Park yesterday on a 250-mile march to Washington, D.C. They demand a Clean Dream Act that will address DACA and the future of nearly 800,000 young immigrants brought to the U.S. as children.
Here to call again on Congress to use the power it was given by the people to pass legislation that protects dreamers but does not put our families in danger.
The group, who call themselves the Walk to Stay Home, will reach Princeton, New Jersey around 6 p.m. on Saturday night and stay at the Nassau Presbyterian Church. Many black schoolchildren will be given free tickets this weekend to see a movie with a superhero that looks like them. Black Panther, the latest movie from Marvel Comics, hit theaters last night and is expected to take at least $145 million at the box office this weekend. We'll have more on that later. Federal and state agencies, including the FBI, continue to investigate a death in Mississippi, where a 21-year-old African-American man has been found dead hanging from a tree. Some are attributing the death to suicide, but the man's family disagree, and the NAACP are calling for a deeper investigation. It's a day of firsts for women in New York as the New York Botanical Gardens appoint their first female president. And in Staten Island, 9-year-old Grace Gaffney became the first female to be admitted into the Cub Scouts. Stocks are up for the 6th day in a row after last week's bumpy ride. It's 53 degrees and raining in Central Park. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Augusta Anthony.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Stevie Hertz.
And I'm Dan Rabb. In both a tweet and a speech yesterday, President Trump framed the Florida school shooting as a mental health issue. He said the shooter was mentally disturbed and should have been reported to authorities.
13 Russian nationalists were indicted this afternoon. These the first criminals charges for meddling in the 2016 U.S. election.
What was your reaction to the president's tweet and his comments to the country yesterday?
Well, thanks so much for having me. And first of all, let me just say that I can completely understand as a psychiatrist and also as someone who studies gun policy why people turn to questions of mental illness directly in the aftermath of mass shootings. And also, as we're going to see here, I'm sure, and have seen in other mass shootings, many mass shooters have significant psychiatric histories. But when a head of government starts positioning mental illness as the main framework for our intervention, I have to say I find it unbelievably frustrating and infuriating. What I hear when people like President Trump say this is just a mental illness question is shutting the door on looking at all of those other factors that help us understand and prevent these.
Can you unpack a little bit of that research for us? I know you yourself published a major study that examined whether or not there's a link between mental illness and violence.
I think from a psychiatric perspective, a couple of factors are important. Number one, there's no mental illness whose symptoms are attacking somebody, shooting somebody, committing acts of violence. A second factor is that people with mental illness are more likely to be the victims of violence. There was a big case in New York, actually, that was decided yesterday, where police officers went to the home of a woman with schizophrenia who was in her bed without any clothes on, acting bizarre, and she ended up, they shot her fatally. And I think that that's indicative of what we see across the country, which is that people with mental illness illness are far more likely to be shot than to shoot other people.
You mentioned the case of Deborah Danner, the Bronx woman who was shot and killed by an NYPD officer last year. The officer involved in her death was acquitted yesterday. And the case highlighted the fact that, especially in communities of color, authorities are not always seen as trusted partners. And in the aftermath of our president telling people to alert authorities to warning signs, how would you suggest someone does reach out for help?
People do end up tending to stay away from psychiatric care because of these stigmatizations, and particularly about the fear that authorities or their doctors will have to report them. I think the other point to remember, since you bring it up, is that there are racial politics to this question of mental illness, and the argument is basically that it's very easy for us to call the lone white male shooter mentally ill, but when a person of color commits a shooting, we often link to problems of black culture or terrorism, bigger, broader categories.
If the president does want to make the conversation just about mental health, what would you suggest are some of the steps that we could take?
Well, let me just say that I don't think the conversation should just be about mental health. Just making the conversation about mental health is a line that the corporate gun lobby has been pressing for years now. The argument is basically that it's not a gun or bullet problem, it's a mental illness problem, and the NRA in the past has pushed for a national registry of people with mental illness, not of gun ownership. And so in that regard, I would just say, first of all, that I would not accept the premise, but of course it looks like that's what's being pushed now. I think that there are common sense public health measures, and so I think it's important for people to realize that mental illness diagnosis or just mental health expertise is not a predictive science. And so it's not like a mental health person is going to be able to interview 1,000 people and tell you which one person is going to go on to commit a mass shooting. It doesn't work that way.
Dr. Metzel, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much.
That was Dr. Jonathan Metzel, the director of the Center for Medicine, Health and Society at Vanderbilt University. 13 Russian nationals were indicted this afternoon. These are the first criminal charges for meddling in the 2016 U.S. election. Eileen Grench reports.
I spoke to Mark Simakovsky, Atlantic Council Fellow and former Department of Defense staffer, to find out what this all means.
Again, it showcases, a multi-year, multi-directional, multi-state, with millions of dollars finance campaign to discredit and divide the American public and undermine our institutions.
The indictment states that these Russians unwittingly spoke and coordinated with Trump campaign officials. We asked Simakovsky, does this absolve the Trump campaign from collusion?
Absolutely not. So what I think this indictment showcases is it'll put even more pressure on the administration to take additional steps to punish Russia for those actions.
Russian government officials just denounced these indictments as absurd, and minutes ago, President Trump responded that the election meddling began long before he ran for president.
The Russian government has already come out calling this absurd, so it continues to complicate relations.
That was our reporter, Eileen Grench. Experts are calling this year's flu season the worst they've seen in years. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have been hospitalized with flu symptoms, and the Center for Disease Control expects the death toll to rise.
But most Americans still aren't vaccinated. Sarah Wyman has more about the strategies doctors and nurses are turning to persuade the uninoculated.
Attention, everyone. Let us stop the flu in its tracks. Practice.
It's 5 p.m. on a Thursday, and I'm sandwiched in between sweaty commuters on the 123 subway platform at Times Square, 42nd Street. You can almost taste the germs in the warm, moist air, and as a train door slides open, a fresh crowd of wheezing, coughing New Yorkers spills out.
If you have not already, consider getting a flu shot.
Most experts agree. Getting the flu shot is the single best way of preventing flu outbreaks. But statistically speaking, less than half of the New Yorkers sharing a subway platform with me have actually gotten the shot. Danielle Offrey, an associate professor of medicine at NYU, says one reason is they just don't understand how dangerous the flu is.
The old-fashioned washing machines where you ran the clothes through the wringer? Imagine your bones going through the wringer. That's what influenza is like.
And if you haven't had the flu, getting the vaccine might not feel like a priority. It costs money. Getting it takes time. And not everyone's convinced it's effective or safe. Offrey says doctors need to make a point of challenging those assumptions.
So, and why don't you want to get the flu shot? I want them to, defend their answer. Why is it that they're not doing it?
But it's harder to ask those questions and correct misunderstandings when patients don't come into a doctor's office in the first place. Where are they going instead? Google. Melody Butler is a nurse who knows her way around a Facebook comment section. We're standing in the back of the Kmart in Penn Station, hemmed in by aisles full of stuffed animals for Valentine's Day. Butler only has 15 minutes, and this is the quietest place we could find. Little red notification bubbles keep popping up as she scrolls through Twitter, Facebook, and Pinterest.
Here's a group. It has over 2,000 members in it. And they'll have questions. Let's say, is flu serious?
Butler is the founder of Nurses Who Vaccinate, an online network of nurses who answer questions about vaccines across social media platforms.
Most of our education takes place over the internet because where are patients going at 2 o'clock in the morning? They're not calling their doctor. They're not emailing the CDC. They're asking in their parenting groups, they're going on neighborhood groups, and they're asking very simple questions like, should I get the flu shot this year?
Butler and her team want to make sure they're the ones answering those questions. That when patients go looking for information about the flu vaccine online, they're finding the real stuff. So far, it seems to be working.
My name's Laura Calise, and I'm from Annapolis, Maryland.
For years, Calise never got the flu shot. She wasn't worried about getting the flu. She'd heard some sketchy stuff about vaccines from friends, and when she'd gotten the shot in the past, it had made her feel sick. But in early 2012, all that started to change.
I miscarried my second child, and that was whenever my whole perception of risk basically evolved.
Calise spent hours doing research online, and the health professionals and researchers she found there were publishing work debunking some of the theories she'd been buying into. Armed with information, Calise isn't willing to take risks with her kids that she would take on herself.
Because once you know what can go wrong, I think that you're much more likely to be like, this is a priority.
Physicians like Danielle Offrey agree this is progress. But if we really want to get everyone vaccinated, they say we have to work on access to the shots themselves, not just information. That means getting the flu shot to New Yorkers instead of the other way around.
In the subway, stand there in the subway. You think the subway, Poles Groske, and get your flu shot right here.
In the meantime, I'll wait for a less crowded car. Sarah Wyman, Columbia Radio News.
And now it's time for City Sounds, where we meet one New Yorker. Here's 92-year-old Enid Rubin, remembering her favorite piece of art.
When I traveled with my husband abroad, I came to like Romanesque art, so he gave me a book, and there was a little capital of a little man in a flame-like skirt and with a hat on, who is confronting a monster. Well, monsters are quite usual in Romanesque art, but this monster had 3 heads, and that is unusual. And it said that it was a monster. Gee whiz, I could see that. And I wanted to know what it was. I had a friend who was in graduate school at the Institute of Fine Art. I said, Isabel, what is this? And she said, oh, well, if you're going to try to do that, you're going to really have to take courses here. So at 39, I wound up working on a master's degree at the Institute of Fine Arts. And to this day, I do not know what that little figure and the 3-headed monster really meant.
Thanks to reporter Juliet Jabkira.
In Washington, immigration reform efforts have stalled yet again. Yesterday, the Senate rejected 4 different immigration bills. My co-host Stevie Hertz spoke to Julia Gellett, a senior analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, about where this leaves us.
So what happened in the Senate yesterday?
So yesterday, the Senate voted on 4 bills, 3 of which would have provided some path to legal status for dreamers, or unauthorized immigrants who entered the United States as children. They also voted on 1 bill related to sanctuary cities. And all 4 of the bills failed to get the 60 votes needed to pass.
So what were 2 of the strongest proposals?
2 of the strongest proposals were a bipartisan bill that was put together by a group of senators that would have offered a path to citizenship for dreamers, as well as some border funding, some language around immigration enforcement priorities, and some minor changes to green cards for family-sponsored immigrants. And then the other proposal that was backed by the White House and by the Senate leadership was a conservative proposal by Senator Grassley that paired more enforcement measures and bigger cuts to family-sponsored immigration, as well as a path to citizenship for Dreamers.
And we've spoken a lot about the Senate recently. What's happening in the House?
That was also very unclear. In the Senate Majority Leader had promised to take up the issue of immigration reform. In the House, there was no such promise. All we're seeing in the House right now is an effort from the right to try to push a quite conservative, enforcement-heavy bill. It's not clear that that is going to pass either, so it's been a big question mark hanging over the debate whether the House even would take up something were the Senate to pass it.
So if both the bipartisan effort failed and the White House-supported bill failed, where does this leave us for immigration reform?
It's very unclear at this moment. I think there may be some pressure for a temporary fix to enshrine DACA, the temporary protection for Dreamers, into law, and kind of kick the can down the road to deal with the issue again in the future.
What would that look like?
A temporary fix could mean writing the DACA program into law. So DACA provides 2-year renewable periods of protection from deportation and of work authorization. So a temporary fix might continue to allow Dreamers to apply for temporary protections and perhaps renew those temporary protections. But it would not involve any path to getting a green card or to getting citizenship for Dreamers.
Why would this be left to the court system rather than Congress?
So there have been some lawsuits filed questioning the legality of the end of the DACA program, and 2 courts have said that while the courts weigh the merit of that argument, the government should keep accepting DACA renewals. The matter is already headed to the Supreme Court, which should take it up this summer.
Yeah, and the Dreamers, have they distracted us from a wider debate on immigration reform that's needed in America?
There's certainly a need for wider debate on immigration reform. I think most folks from all political parties agree that our immigration system is long overdue for reform, that there are many problems with it. At the same time, I think that the attempts that have been taken in recent weeks to tie some of those bigger changes to a solution for Dreamers have made it very difficult to pass a bill because immigration reform is incredibly contentious, and that's why it's been so long since we've been able to revise our laws. The last big immigration reforms happened in 1990, and before that in 1965, so it's been a long time.
Julia Gellert, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Despite gridlock in Washington, the New York State Assembly passed its own version of the DREAM Act earlier this month. The bill doesn't promise a path to citizenship, but it would allow undocumented students access to state financial aid.
This will be the 5th consecutive year the bill has been approved in the Assembly, but it has never passed the state Senate. Reporter Colin Marston has more.
In a lot of ways, Buthra is your average 23-year-old trying to make it in New York City.
Going to school full-time. I'm shooting a short film. I just got cast for a show, so I rehearse for that every day. And then I work full-time. And then I still have a social life because I'm fun. But it's a lot.
But there's something different about Buthra. For one thing, Buthra isn't her real name. We're not using it because she's afraid of being deported. Like some other 40,000 people in New York State, she came to the U.S. at a young age without papers.
I was born in Turkey, and I moved here when I was 7. I was very lucky growing up. We were middle class.
But while many middle-class families can rely on financial aid to make college affordable, Buthra's couldn't.
That's sort of when I started to fully come to terms with the fact that I was undocumented.
New York State has offered in-state tuition to undocumented students since 2002, but has not offered scholarships or financial aid. That's where the New York DREAM Act comes in. It will allow undocumented students access to the state's $930 million yearly tuition assistance program, or TAP. According to the state comptroller, the new bill would add $20 million, a 2% increase. Here's Speaker Heastie announcing its passage in the New York State Assembly earlier this month.
We simply cannot achieve our mission to put families first if the most vulnerable among us are forced to live in the shadows, under the threat of persecution and deportation, or even worse, cut off from critical services they need to live lawful and independent lives.
The bill passed 89-44. Assemblyman Ron Castorina of Staten Island South Shore was one of the no votes.
When you have a situation where
middle-class citizens in our state, in my district, can't get assistance for college through TAP. It's unfathomable that you could support this bill.
Castorina says it's okay for Dreamers to get private financial aid, but not public assistance. First, he says the state should make TAP available to more middle-class families. Currently, a family has to make $80,000 a year or less to qualify for TAP. Castorina wants to raise that cap to $150,000. Emily Skydell is with NYPIRG, a student advocacy group. She disagrees. She says higher education for undocumented students would benefit the state.
The reality is, state public investment in higher education is an investment in our economy.
According to a 2011 study from the University of Buffalo, for every dollar invested in New York's public higher education system, there's a $5 return through economic growth. For Busra, though, this isn't just policy, it's her life.
I grew up here. I'm American. I consider myself American. I also consider myself Turkish, but I consider myself just as American.
The New York DREAM Act is currently making its way through the State Senate Higher Education Committee. In the meantime, Busra will continue to pay $8,000 in full tuition at CUNY, unsure what happens next. Colin Marston, Columbia Radio News.
Democrats and Republicans across the country are already gearing up for November's elections. And party leaders on both sides want to know, how will President Trump affect their chances in the midterms? Augusta Anthony reports on how things are playing out in New York State.
In New York, Republicans hold just 9 of 27 congressional seats. And in an era of increasingly tribal politics, it's easy to think this blue state might get bluer this November. But don't count Republicans out just yet, says Jessica Proud, a spokesperson for the New York Republican Party.
Well, if you look at the president's numbers, yes, he is unpopular in New York City, but New York is actually a whole diverse state. In some areas, the president will be a benefit where he remains popular. And in others, we really need to rely on the strength of our local candidates and their message.
Proud thinks that voters will be focused on the improving economy and their local candidates rather than President Trump.
I tend to give voters more credit. While they may not love his tweets or some of the things that the president says, I think generally voters are feeling like the economy is moving in the right direction, and that is ultimately what is going to be the most pivotal factor in the 2018 election.
But veteran political commentator Thomas Edsall from the New York Times disagrees. He sees a trend that suggests local candidates are tied to the national party.
The overwhelming trend over the past 2 decades has been the nationalization of elections.
So what's on the national agenda in these midterms?
I mean, there are a lot of other issues on people's minds, but the overwhelming issue is Trump.
Jeff Berman, executive director of the New York State Democrats, also thinks that the Republican candidates in New York are going to have to answer for the national party's policies.
The question, I think, this year is, if you're a Republican and you're asking for folks to vote for you, what is your response to what you see coming out of Washington, Mrs. or Mr. Republican candidate?
And New Yorkers' response to what they see coming out of Washington hasn't exactly been positive. Few scenes were more defiant than the Women's March last month in upstate New York, where there are more Republican voters than in the city. In Albany, protesters already had November on their minds. The question will be whether those protesters show up to vote. At a town hall on the Lower East Side last week, one Democratic voter, 55-year-old Carol Anastasio, wasn't optimistic.
I'm a little sour on that, to be honest with you, because I thought Hillary was going to win by a landslide.
She does, however, think that voter turnout may be in the Democrats' favor.
So as long as Russia stays out of our election and if more people go out to vote, then we'll be in good shape.
But a Republican voter isn't so sure. Stephen Evans, secretary of the West Side Republican Club, doesn't think the Democrats are offering voters enough in these midterms.
You know, I only see and hear the resistance and hatred for the president. It's almost like their entire party platform has been thrown away, and all they do is say, we hate Donald Trump.
Democrats seem to be riding the anti-Trump wave for now. One example is in Alabama, where outrage against President Trump defeated the candidate he had endorsed, especially among African American voters who were key in a Democratic victory. These demographics will matter nationally in November, but it's too early to tell who will come out to the polls. But if you don't like what's been coming out of Washington, you'd better be prepared to show up, says Thomas Edsel.
Basically, if the Republicans retain control of the House and Senate this coming November, Trump will feel that his style of governing has basically been endorsed by the electorate, and he will become as or more extreme in his behavior.
Whatever message New Yorkers send to Washington this November, support for a strong economy or a vote of outrage, they'll be thinking of President Trump as they cast their ballots in the midterms. Augusta Anthony, Columbia Radio News.
Today's the first day of Lunar New Year. The celebrations include dancers, dragons, and firecrackers. The holiday is also good for business in Chinatown and Lower Manhattan, a neighborhood that's been changing a lot. Juliet Jubkiro reports.
3, 2, 1.
These are the firecrackers kicking off the ceremony. It's the first event of the Lunar Chinese New Year celebrations. In the Sarah Roosevelt Park in downtown Manhattan, a crowd is watching women dance in traditional clothes, mostly red, for good luck. Kelly Luan is Chinese American. She's one of 400 high school students helping with the event. She says she wants to be an active member in her community.
Chinatown is just really such a good place for me to go. It's a place where I can see my own culture in New York City. I think it's a place where I can really feel at home.
Stephen Tin hopes more young people will feel like Kelly. He's the head of a Better Chinatown USA.
We are trying to do everything in our power to help to bring awareness of what's going on in Chinatown.
And what's going on is that the Chinese population is dropping.
The neighborhood, basically the traditional older community is moving out or passing away.
And the population replacing them is wealthier and white. That's according to data collected by the city. But Tin is not giving up. He says business can attract tourists and other Chinese from the other boroughs.
One of our mission is to keep this going, not only the cultural side and also the business side.
David Lay is the owner of the Grand Advance supermarket, right at the corner of the Roosevelt Park. He says he sees a jump in business about 10-15% this time of year. That helps with rising rents.
Every year we have a little increasement for that compared to the normal days.
And the rent isn't going up just for stores. Restaurants are getting hit too. Wellington Chen is member of the Chinatown Business Improvement District.
The days of you coming expect to get very, very cheap food, those days are long gone.
Chen says it's just a natural consequence of the neighborhood evolution.
Compared to other communities that are going through this retail change right now, Chinatown is actually holding its own as increasing its diversity.
That diversity will really be on display over the next couple of weeks as Lunar New Year celebrations continue. The Big Dragon Parade is next Sunday. Juliette Jepkiro, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Dan Rabb.
And I'm Stevie Hertz.
Coming up, we find out how a plan to fix New York's subway could cause problems for taxi drivers.
And we'll hear from a woman who's keen to get into the cannabis business.
These stories and more. But first, the news.
From New York, I'm Colin Marston. Young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers are in limbo today after the Senate failed to move forward legislation on immigration reform. At the end of the week, 4 separate measures failed, including the president's proposal and one from the Common Sense Coalition, a centrist group of lawmakers. The Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had promised a full week of open debate on immigration after the February 7th spending bill was passed to keep the government open. President Trump ended an Obama-era executive order called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, or DACA, in September, which shields Dreamers from deportation. The directive will expire on March 5th. The FBI admits it mishandled several tips on the perpetrator of Wednesday's high school shooting in Parkland, Florida. The Bureau received a second warning on January 5th about Nicholas Cruz, but never responded. Cruz is accused of opening fire on Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, killing 17 people with a semi-automatic rifle. The attack comes in the context of increasing mass shootings across the U.S., already the country with the world's highest number. Special Counsel Robert Mueller's office has indicted 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian organizations for interference in the 2016 U.S. election. Mueller had already brought charges against several Trump campaign officials, but these are the first criminal charges against Russian nationals. The indictment targets the Internet Research Agency, a hacking group funded by the Russian government. In Turkey, 6 journalists were sentenced to life in prison after being accused of abetting the 2016 coup attempt against President Recep Erdogan and of supporting U.S.-based Islamic cleric Fethullah Gulen. 2 Turkish journalists were charged with giving subliminal messages during a TV show appearance a day before the coup. The charges are the latest example of Erdogan's increasingly autocratic regime, where since the July 2016 coup, 50,000 people have been detained and over 150,000 public servants, teachers, and journalists fired. Cyril Ramaphosa, the new president of South Africa, delivered his first major speech today on the need for political and economic stability in the country.
We have been given the responsibility as South Africans to build a new nation, to confront the injustices of the past and the inequalities of the present.
Ramaphosa was elected by the South African National Assembly on Thursday after former President Jacob Zuma was forced to resign in the wake of corruption allegations. Ramaphosa and Zuma are both members of the ruling African National Congress Party, the party founded by Nelson Mandela in 1994. It's currently 53 degrees and raining in Manhattan. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Colin Marston.
New York's yellow taxis are iconic, but the rise of companies like Uber and Lyft have left them struggling.
Now they may face a new challenge. A proposal to reduce traffic would charge drivers a fee to enter Manhattan below 60th Street. That could hit yellow taxis hard. Madeline Thompson reports.
Hello. He left the receipt at home? Yeah. Okay. So then how can I give you credit? Well, it's 3 p.m. at NYC Taxi Group in Brooklyn. Yellow cabs arrive and then depart with fresh drivers. Jean Charles Mark is a 31-year veteran of the industry. He's just finished the morning shift, and it wasn't a very lucrative one.
It's really tough. It's very, very tough for us.
Like many drivers, Mark usually heads across the Brooklyn Bridge into Manhattan at the beginning of his day. Governor Andrew Cuomo could soon charge him an additional $2 to $5 just to reach his first fare. Mark says that could really add up for yellow cabs making multiple trips between boroughs. Individuals driving their own vehicles would be charged $11.50, but Mark doesn't think that will keep them from coming.
People who drive into the city is not like us, who try to make a living. These are the people that be able to afford that kind of stuff. But right now, we try to survive now.
The experts who put together Cuomo's proposal are aware of this. One is the aptly nicknamed Gridlock Sam Schwartz, a transportation engineer and former cab driver who worked on the plan. He says Uber cars outnumber cabs 4-1, and it's not fair to punish yellow cabs for their prominence. The proposal would also raise money to fix the city's ailing subway system, but it turns out cabs already pay 50 cents per trip to the MTA.
I think it's worth thinking about yellow taxis as being part of the public transportation system.
The proposal currently taxes all for-hire drivers the same amount, but Schwartz says that could change. While taxis are an integral part of moving New Yorkers around, they don't have the luxury of a monopoly like the subway does. And where cabs have faltered, competitors have swooped in. For example, people of color have long complained that yellow cabs discriminate against them. Jamal James says he has taken no more than 4 yellow cabs in his lifetime.
They don't stop for me at all. I used to have my white female friend flag one down for me, and then I come out of the blue and sit in the car.
Even though he drives for Uber, James is sympathetic. He and Schwartz agree the city should do something to preserve the iconic yellow vehicles. Until that day comes, Alexei Medvedevsky isn't too worried. He owns NYC Taxi Group in Brooklyn, where Jean Charles Mark works, and says rideshare cars have their own shortcomings. Imagine it's rush hour and a passenger orders an Uber.
Because of the traffic, it takes 15 to 20 minutes for that particular Uber car to go around the block, while 3 to 5 empty cabs pass by that passenger.
Sorely tempting the impatient rider to cancel their Uber and flag one down. Medvedevsky says even the crumbling subway system works in cabs' favor. Train delays mean more frustrated commuters hailing cabs. And if it comes to it, he has his own idea for how to ease congestion without burdening his drivers.
I think cabs should be allowed to use bus lanes.
Medvedevsky says his employees are putting in far more hours to make the same amount of money they did just a few years ago. For one driver, these conditions took a fatal toll. Earlier this month, Doug Shifter committed suicide in front of City Hall because he said he was in financial ruin. In a note on Facebook, he wrote that he hoped his death would bring attention to the issue. Some younger drivers are changing careers or taking second jobs, but industry veterans like Jean-Charles Marks say it's too late for them.
We're the landmark of New York City when you're talking about the yellow cab, so let's hope for the best.
Cuomo's proposal has a ways to go before it's implemented. In the meantime, despite a tenuous future, Mark will keep doing what he's always done. Madeline Thompson, Columbia Radio News.
And now, another story from City Sounds, where we meet one New Yorker. Here's musical comedienne Sarah Gall.
So I started writing this song in a very mild way. I thought, what if I just wrote a story about an ex-boyfriend who's a little creepy and he stalks me. I'm kind of enjoying a refreshing bushwalk and he shows up in the middle of a bush, which obviously is terrifying. And then I just kind of push him in the river and accidentally kill this guy. And to describe it, it sounds like a really horrific song. Then a hand reaches out of the dark river, you pull your body on the bank and you start to But then I was playing it through with a friend and he's like, why wouldn't you push it to the extreme? What would you like to do or say or do to this guy if you had no limits? And that's kind of where comedy is at its best. Shoved you back in, yeah, I shoved you back in. I shoved you back in, shoved you back in. Yay, I killed a man.
Reporter Eileen Grinch assures us no men were harmed in the making of that piece.
Legal cannabis is a big business across the country. In 2017, it took in over $8 billion in revenue. And now, as New York and New Jersey debate legalization, women want to cash in. My co-host Stevie Hertz reports.
Investors, entrepreneurs, and lawyers are gathered in a high-rise office overlooking Times Square. It looks like a classic networking event. A lot of hors d'oeuvres, power suits, and business cards. But these corporate types are meeting to discuss an industry that's still mostly illegal in New York. Cannabis, and specifically how women can make money from it.
One of the reasons women are in the cannabis industry is that we tend to be risk takers. We're the original witches, so we're not scared of playing with a plant.
Jenny R.G. started her Brooklyn business, Baked at Home, after she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2015. She focuses on the wellness market.
I sell infused CBD coconut oil that would benefit people with arthritis, helps blood flow, creates more of a chi to the body.
Because RG's products are made from hemp and aren't intoxicating, she can legally sell them here. Recreational cannabis is currently illegal in New York State, but that might change soon. In January, Governor Cuomo proposed funding a study to see the pros and cons of legalizing recreational use. Hedge fund director Emily Paxia says one of those benefits is that, for women, there's less of a glass ceiling.
There's an opportunity to insert ourselves at the ground floor instead of trying to retroactively muscle in after it's gotten too far down the path of being potentially more male skewed.
And Paxia is part of that. Only 1 in 20 hedge funds employs a female portfolio manager, according to a study by Northeastern University. So she created her own in a relatively open market, investing in the cannabis industry. But despite her success, Paxia is now worried.
We are seeing a little bit of a homogenization of the type of people who are running companies, and it does tend to be a lot of white males.
According to a survey by trade publication Marijuana Business Daily, women make up less than a third of cannabis executives, and that's still more than the national average. But as the industry gets bigger and more corporate, women could get squeezed out. And it's even worse for women of colour. Dr. Shonda Macias works to get more women involved through her industry group, Women Grow. I called her at her busy dispensary in D.C.
There's just a lot of barriers that we have to go through.
Just 5% of cannabis executives are minority women. Macias says it's because banks won't lend to cannabis businesses, so you have to rely on your own savings. That's tough for women of colour. And there's also some fear because of cannabis arrests, says Macias.
Black women starting their own businesses are still fearful just because of the history of it. If the black man has been locked up because of this industry, our families remove the black woman, what do our children have?
According to the ACLU, African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested over marijuana use than white people, even though they use it at about the same rate. But despite all of this, through organisations like Women Grow, support, knowledge and money is being passed around. So, Macias is hopeful.
I've seen black women, Asian women, I've seen Latino women now having the courage to come out the cannabis closet and to actually start their ventures in this industry.
And back at the networking event in New York, the corporate types are also looking forward.
I would like my own wellness business.
Anna Liu graduated from Wesleyan last year and is eager to get started. But she's not quite sure what that would look like.
Spa, maybe, like massage therapy, using like cannabis oils, having just like a lounge bar area. Honestly, it can be anything.
New Jersey's new governor, Phil Murphy, campaigned on full legalization. And in Massachusetts, you'll be able to light up from July. So Liu and women like her have high hopes. Stevie Hertz, Columbia Radio News.
Last night, Marvel's much-anticipated film Black Panther opened in theaters. It raked in over $25 million at the box office, making it one of the highest-grossing opening nights for Marvel.
And the film is proving a hit with black audiences, from hardcore comic book fans to film buffs to those who are just excited to finally see a movie with a cast of all black characters. Jennifer Siegel reports.
It's opening night of Black Panther, and inside Harlem's Magic Johnson Theater at 125th Street, the third-floor lobby is packed. By 8:30, a line has already formed for the 9 o'clock showing. Alexandra Moffett-Bateau bought her tickets a month and a half ago.
We're just super excited to be supporting a black film that's so groundbreaking in so many ways. We wanted to come see it in Harlem. This is one of the only black-owned theaters in the area.
Moffett-Bateau says she's there to support a film that moves black actors beyond stereotypes. Her friend, Asia Burrell Wood, is standing next to her in line, and both are wearing colorful, traditional African print fabrics.
I try to put together the best of Wakanda fashions that I could think of. No better time to wear it, and I was actually really excited to have the occasion.
Wakanda is the fictional African country where the movie takes place, something that fans of the original comic might know, like Rihanna. No, not that Rihanna. In the lobby, 14-year-old Rihanna from the Bronx has just seen the film. She's so excited, she's spilling popcorn everywhere.
I just love the diversity, how they kept to the African roots with the all-natural hair and the traditional clothing.
So do you give the movie 5 stars?
Oh yeah, 10 stars, 15. It's perfect. I loved it.
William Foster is a comic book historian. He says the film is a milestone.
Oh, we are in geek heaven. The idea that we have a black superhero who is in front of in his own film, never thought we'd see the day.
The star of the film is T'Challa, a.k.a. the Black Panther. Played by Chadwick Boseman, he has to battle enemy forces for his rightful place on the throne. The cast is full of big-name black actors, from Michael B. Jordan to Lupita Nyong'o. Sheena Howard is a comic book writer who blogs about comics too. She says T'Challa and the other characters go beyond the two-dimensional roles often available to black actors.
We don't get to see all of the elements of black existence in media and film, which is part of the problem historically with the representation of black people. And so when young people and adults can see themselves in a variety of different dimensions on film, it really does something for your self-concept.
And, Howard says, Black Panther is effectively fighting another bad guy, the myth that people of color can't sell movie tickets. The film is expected to take in up to $180 million at the box office this weekend. Eric Cohn is deputy editor and chief critic at IndieWire. He says the movie satisfies Marvel's fan base without needing a cameo from Iron Man or Captain America. At the end of the day, he says, it's just well made.
Even if you aren't a Marvel person or even somebody who's necessarily galvanized by the kind of cultural significance of this movie, you might still get something out of it just because it's really good filmmaking and you really do have the perfect balance of art and commerce.
Back at Magic Johnson Theater in Harlem, the film will be showing every half an hour from 9 a.m. to 11 at night. Jennifer Siegel, Columbia Radio News.
That's it for this edition of Uptown Radio.
Our foreman today was executive producer Bo Hamby. Senior producer Juan Torres Falcon led our reporting staff.
Director Sarah Wyman coordinated our studio production with Wendy Rhodes and Mira Gable.
Madeline Thompson got this streamed live to the web. Eileen Grinch helped with production. Editor Elisa Escarce and assistant editor Cassiana McClanahan led our copy team.
Radio professionals Sally Herships, Deb Amos, Gilda DeCarli, and Ben Shapiro advised our staff, with support from Carrie Donahue. I'm Dan Rabb.
And I'm Stevie Hertz. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here, thanks for listening.